Hello and greetings from Raising Voices. If you are watching this, you are likely planning to use SOSE Together. Congratulations and welcome. This video shows you how to use the capacity grid in the SOSE Together setup guide to determine community size, staffing, and to make other important decisions that will help you establish strong foundations for effective SOSE Together programming. This video is especially for people who do not love big grids and tables with numbers, like many of us. We hope this video will help it feel simple and to plan well for effective violence against women prevention. This is Grace. Grace works for a women's rights organization. She is preparing to write a proposal and wants to use SOSE Together in the communities where her organization works. Grace talks with Raising Voices, who created SOSE Together. Grace learns that SOSE Together has 3 core strategies. 1. Local activism led by community activists, 2. Community leadership led by community leaders, and 3. Institutional strengthening led by institutional allies. Raising Voices explains that it's important to have enough activists, leaders, and allies, and enough staff to support them, for SOSE Together to work well and effectively prevent violence against women. Raising Voices staff shows Grace the capacity grid in the setup guide and explains that this is the first step to figuring out how many staff, community activists, community leaders, and institutional allies she will need to write into her proposal. Grace wants to use SOSE Together in a densely populated city, with 90,000 people where people live close together, and it's easy to walk around the community and interact with many people in a short time. If Grace is working in a densely populated area, she will need roughly 1 activist to reach 1,500 people with SOSE Together ideas and activities. So, Grace calculates that she will need about 60 activists. Now that Grace knows how many community activists she will need to reach her communities, she can think about the number of staff needed to support them. It is important that staff are able to regularly visit and support community activists to mentor and support them as they build their skills and confidence in facilitating SOSE Together activities. If staff have too many activists to support, they may feel overwhelmed. And if staff aren't able to regularly visit and support, activists may feel confused or unsupported and demotivated. They may stop doing activities, or their activities may be ineffective. To avoid this, Grace wants to plan for enough staff to provide regular mentorship and support to keep activists feeling motivated. She plans 1 full-time member of staff in her densely populated area to regularly visit and support 25 to 30 community activists. Since she has 60 community activists, she will need 2 full-time members of staff to support them. Now that Grace has figured out how many staff and community activists she needs, she moves on to community leader. Grace looks at the next row in the capacity grid about community leaders. Looking at the capacity grid, Grace sees that there can be 40 to 50 leaders per community. With a large community like hers, she will choose 50 and will write in another staff member to support them. She remembers reading that finding the right community leaders for SOSE Together is essential. So they will have to go through the process to find the right leaders for the role. Since leaders will not be engaging quite as intensively as community activists, 1 staff member can support all 50 leaders. Finally, Grace thinks about how her program will work with institutions. Grace looks at the next row in the capacity grid about institutions and allies. Grace knows that working with institutions can be challenging and time-consuming, so chooses only 2 institutions. Within each of those institutions, Grace figures she will need 6 allies each, so 12 institutional allies altogether. Grace factors in 1 more member of staff to support these allies and guide the work with institutions. Altogether, Grace has realized that, to create change for her community of 90,000 people, she will need 4 staff working directly in communities. She will also need some time from a learning and assessment person to help track progress, generate learning, and strengthen implementation, as well as a percentage of her own time for overall coordination. And to summarize, these people will be working with 60 activists, 50 community leaders, and 12 institutional allies who work within 2 institutions. Grace now has all the basic information to support her proposal. Satisfied, Grace says goodbye to the Raising Voices team person on Zoom, and goes out for a coffee break, where she meets William and Betty. They want to use SOSE Together in their communities too. but they work in rural areas. Grace shows them the other columns of the capacity grid to help them in their own planning for different types of communities. Grace and her team are now well on their way to effective violence against women prevention programming. We hope that Grace's story has been helpful in explaining some of the considerations in designing a new SOSA Together program. Using the capacity grid and thinking through some of these ratios of staff to community activists, for example, can help set the right foundations for effective programming and avoid problems later on. You can access the setup guide for SOSA Together on our website, and you can reach out to Raising Voices for support at any time.